I'm just going to take one more before news. Steve is in Riverview in Ipswich, Queensland. Hi, Steve. Welcome.
Hi, Neil. How you going?
Good. Need to be quick, Steve. What's your question or your comment?
Yep. I've heard a Bible teacher go saying that some of the genealogies, there's gaps between saying he was the son of and he's actually like the great-grandson or something like that. Can you comment on that, please?
Bodie, gaps in genealogies.
Yeah, we deal with that actually in our Answers book, Volume 1. If you hop on the website, answersingenesis.org, type in gaps in the genealogies, we do take a look at that. I've heard that kind of claim as well. But when you actually look at the ones and say Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11, it's giving you all the chronological data from father to son. So in those particular instances, we're not seeing any instance where it is a grandson. In fact, you got to be very careful when you tally those up. Otherwise, you start having people go beyond the flood without being on the ark. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Does that also, there's also the gap theory, in Job where it says about that the earth was there and then God created and there was a big gap before he actually created man. There's a gap theory going around about,
We might have to wait until after news to be able to tackle the gap theory. Undoubtedly, there's a longer answer than we've got because we're about to break for news. Steve will try and tackle that after Vision National News. Steve, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is Bodie Hodge, speaker, writer and researcher with Answers in Genesis. AnswersInGenesis.org, and you'll find those opportunities to ask questions and access a database of fabulous information about all the sorts of things you might be talking about. AnswersInGenesis.org. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. And if you're just joining us, joining into a fascinating conversation about genealogies, tracing a genealogy back to Adam and Eve. If you ever thought you'd like to trace your family tree, get ready. You might have a question to ask, a comment to make, even a critique for the conversation. That's welcome too. Our special guest is an avid genealogy fan who has traced his ancestry back to Adam and Eve. He's also an authority on the dispersion of people groups around the world after the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. Bodie Hodge is a speaker, writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. That's the creation organisation led by Australian creationist Ken Ham. Bodie has a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He's authored numerous articles and book chapters for Answers in Genesis. And he's a regular on Answers News, frequently speaking at the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter in Kentucky in the US on topics like dinosaurs and dragons, the dispersion at Babel, and the biblical response to racism. Bodie, before we take some more calls, just coming back to our caller before the news, and that was Steve in Riverview in Ipswich, who was asking about the gap theory, the thought that somehow or other there's a gap in the very first verse of the Bible. What's your response when that question comes up?
Well, the gap theory was actually a response to this idea millions of years. When people started to throw the Bible out and reject a global flood, and they came up with this idea of long ages, sometimes Christians didn't know what to do with it. And Thomas Chalmers in the early 1800s said, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take all that millions of years and I'm just going to put it between Genesis 1:1 and 2 so I don't have to worry about it. And that became known as gap theory. So they said, between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, there's all this millions of years, and maybe the earth was then recreated. Maybe that's when Satan or Lucifer had fallen. And that was actually a very popular view that really spread. I'd say by the 1840s, a lot of Christians had bought into that. But what they'd done is they essentially had rejected a global flood. Now then, flood in, you got a problem, because if the rock layers are evidence of millions of years and you have a global flood's going to tear up those rock layers and lay down new ones. So you do run into some problems. A couple of other problems is, let's just say, for example, that Satan or Lucifer fell between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Well, Genesis 1 verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. If that's the case, that would make Satan in his sinful state very good. In fact, that would make sin very good. Those are huge theological problems. Another really big problem that people hadn't thought through is if these rock layers were evidence of millions and billions of years, and we're going to put those right back there between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, then that means that God declared all the death that we see in those rock layers and the cancer and the tuberculosis and the thorns and animals eating other animals, all that would also be declared very good. Deuteronomy 32:4 says every work of God is perfect. What we expected was a perfect creation, not one marred with death, bloodshed, and suffering. We need to remember that death, bloodshed, and suffering came in after Adam and Eve sinned against God. That's when God cursed the ground, cursed the animals, and sentenced man to die. What we see are evidence of the flood of Noah's day. We expect to see death in there and suffering and thorns because those were laid down after Adam and Eve sinned against God. We do have a chapter on our website, answersingenesis.org. Just type in gap theory. Several of them will pop up. There's some really good ones on there.